Hi, my name is Jeff. I'm a contributor at Dirty Shirt. Today we're doing a brake job on a 2000 Mazda Miata. Let's take a look down here in the wheel well. I've already lifted the car up and it is raining today, so I've decided to do the work inside the shop. I'm going to do it front to back because it's just easier and I have a little bit more room to do it that way. This is one of the easier brake jobs that I've come across, and really all there is there's just two bolts that hold the caliper on, which has the brake pads contained within it. So there's a bolt here and a bolt below, and when I get to it I'll pull that off there and then replace the pads. And then on this car we're going to also replace the rotors, and we'll take a closer look at the new parts that I've purchased over on the shop or over on the bench in just a second. Also, with regards to the way this the rotor itself comes off, is that sometimes the bearings, especially on American cars, are contained within the rotor, and that's not the case on this vehicle. So that's all going to just kind of fall off, pop off, however you want to say that, and it's pretty easy to do. And you can see back here I've also taken off the back wheel, and it's a little bit dark, but I'm sure you maybe can see a little bit. But the caliper in the back is much smaller, as well as the thickness of the rotor, and we'll go take a closer look at that over on the bench. Okay. So I've got the fronts laid out here, and I've got the backs laid out over in this direction. And if you take a side-by-side comparison of the pads, you can see that they're about half the surface area, the front compared to the rear. And in regards to the total material on these pads, you can see here is that there's a backing plate, and then it's been chemically bonded, somehow bonded to the plate with the actual brake material. And in just a side-by-side comparison again, okay. So what these do is grab hold of the rotor, okay, goes on like that. You've got a inside or an outside and an inside, and that's what the caliper does. It squeezes the rotor, and that's how the car stops. You notice here on the front rotor, it's actually much more robust than the rear. It actually has two surfaces, I guess you might say, with some venting in here, and this is done so that it will cool it. And when you compare that to the rear, it's just one slab of steel. So they're quite a bit different, and apparently it doesn't need that venting on the rears because the fronts do most of the work that of the braking of the car and stopping of the car. So they've beefed this up and they've beefed this down for that reason. What I chose to do here is that if you take this rotor into the shop, or take a used rotor into the shop, what they'll do is machine this down, and they'll run a lathe over this and skinny this up and make sure that this is true and flat. And what I elected to do is not do that. These rotors were only $20 a piece, and if I had them machined at the shop, what I end up doing is running back and forth with rotors and letting them, give them time to do the processing and so forth, and it really slows the job down. And there is also a specification: these cannot become too thin, and there's a measurement process that they go through and all this, and I just didn't want to risk it or mess with any of that at all. And if you go too thin, what will happen is generally the rotor will it'll warp, and it'll give you a pulsation in your pedal. So as this spins, it's no longer true and round, and then you'll get this kind of a pulsation in your pedal. So that's why you machine them. That's why there is a minimum thickness on these parts, and that's how it's actually processed ultimately about whether or not you need new rotors. So that's something I elected not to do. Now I've got about $140 wrapped up in this, and I think that's really a reasonable price overall for just this for what we're getting for our money. Before we go, there's just one more thing that I wanted to show you with regards to the rear pads, and they have what's called a squealer tab on here. And what this does is that before the pad actually wears away and you were to say go metal to metal, so that only this backing plate was touching the rotor, what will kick in before that ever happens is that this little tab will start to drag on the rotor, and its function is to create a whole lot of noise to indicate that there is a problem, but you haven't quite gotten to the serious problem yet with just hitting pure backing plates. So there's a little bit of pad left, and that's an indication to have the car serviced. So they do add those, and it's a real cheap little fix, and it doesn't damage the rotor or anything. It's just a really great way to do that. With these particular parts, what came with they came with this shim, okay, and the shim actually has a sort of a sticky surface on it. And what you do is you place that over the top here, and then you take these tabs and you bend them down. Some parts, what that does is it prevents squealing or chatter with the brake pad, and that's what the shim's purpose actually is. Sometimes they'll come, custom made, and they just kind of snap on, and they're a little bit easier to do than this, this bend thing. But that doesn't look like any real problem to me at all. So that's how we'll handle them. And of course, there's also a lubrication point as well with doing the brake job. And wherever there's sliding or moving surfaces, I will go ahead and add this grease to it. Okay, it's a special brake grease, so that's something that I did pick up as well. For the new rotors, when they come in the packaging, they are completely covered with grease, okay, or actually it's like an oil. And because they're an iron part, they will rust if the manufacturer doesn't treat them in some way. So what I did was I took brake parts cleaner and held them over a sort of a little bucket and cleaned all that grease off, because you don't want to contaminate the new pads with that. But they always come, completely covered with this type of oil. So that's what we're into. I'll probably include some additional pictures on the site. Thanks for watching. Okay, so we're into the back wheel on this brake job on the Miata, and it was a little bit different than what I was anticipating. So let's talk a little bit about what that was. So on a disc brake, it's always a little bit of a challenge in terms of how manufacturers install a parking brake, and it was certainly the case here, and it was a little bit odd about the way this was going to go down. And it's going to be very difficult to see on camera, so I'll sort of do my best to describe it. But the caliper doesn't just come off like up in the front, which was pretty straightforward stuff, right? It's bolts, and it happens in that fashion. In this configuration, what they tell you to do is you remove this plug from the bottom, and then you take and you rotate this whole apparatus up and out. So that's the caliper coming out, but it's still attached here, and there's really no way to get this off without doing all this disassembly back here. I don't want to do that, right? So we're going to leave that intact. So pull the pin out and you can see what's happening. But in this job, we're also doing the rotors as well, right? And I can't get the rotor off unless I remove what they call the mounting support. And the mounting support is a gigantic piece of metal back here that holds the whole caliper over the wheel. Now that was a bit of a trick to get that off, and I had to go dig deep in the toolbox to figure out how exactly what I was going to do. What I ended up doing was using the impact gun and a wobble extension to sort of get back there, because you had no room to get leverage on a wrench. It just wasn't working out well. So the wobble extension allows you to do a little bit of not straight on type of bolt removal. So I used that and it worked perfectly. So now it's time to take this whole deal off of here, and I can tell you right now that these rotors have never been removed from this car. They've been on here for 10 years, right? So what's happened is, and this will be true on all the wheels, and it's true on most wheels, is that this is rusted right here onto this hub, okay? And you can sit here and pull on this all you want. It's not connected in any way, but it's not going to come off. So what we're going to do is take a hammer, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to give it a couple of whacks right here between the stud without touching the stud, or else you'll booger up the threads and that won't work. So here goes. Let's see what happens. So that broke the rust seal, and now the whole rotor comes off, and that's how it's done. Thanks for watching.